It is time for us to get started. So welcome everyone. We are very pleased to have you with us today for our webinar on critical thinking. We are going to be moving pretty rapidly, covering a lot of information today. So please bear with us as we navigate through this really important topic. A couple of housekeeping things that I'd like to share with you before we get started. You are all aware of our webinars that we do once a quarter. We do these at lunchtime so people can either get their teams together and join in and let this be a time of lunch and learn together, or just you individually are doing that. But the two that we have coming up before the year is over, the first is September 20th, and it is called Organizational Commitment and Encouraging Stewardship. And in this webinar, we will be talking about when we're working for an organization, what does it mean to actually feel a level of commitment to that organization in what it is that you do and what it is that the organization does, and why is that important? So that's what we'll be taking a look at there on September 20th. And then our last webinar of the year will be on December 13th, and this one is called Own It. And this one is all about a mindset of ownership and how we as leaders must first have that mindset of ownership. And we'll talk and explore around how we treat things differently, how we behave differently when we own something. And then we'll shift to how do we show ownership in the workplace, and how do we help to invite others to have this mindset of ownership in the workplace, whether you are a small business, a government organization, or a large corporation. How do we do this in the workplace? So we'll be hitting on those. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for each of those. You can register for these on our website at msbcoach.com. The easiest way for me to tell you to get there, rather than us putting that whole long link up, is to just go down the drop-down tab under Resources, click on Upcoming Webinars, and you're right there. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for those. You'll also be getting emails on those as well. So a few other things that I wanted to share with you, if you're not familiar with our books that we have on Amazon. So these books are written from 3 different perspectives, all about leadership. The first is called Stand Out, and Stand Out is written from the personal leadership perspective. How do I continue to develop myself as a leader? The second is Dare to Make a Difference, and Dare to Make a Difference is on team leadership. So how, once I'm leading myself effectively, how do I now lead a team effectively? And the final one is Bottom Line, and Bottom Line is about organizational leadership. So basically, how do I lead leaders, and how do I lead from a visionary perspective within an organization? We're really pleased with these books, because what sets them apart from lots of great leadership books out there, but what sets these apart is that they are built around neuroscience of how do we create new habits. And we create new habits by being consistent in our behaviors. So each of these books, we encourage you to take 33 days to go through it. Each day has an entry that you read and has activities that you do that go with that entry. And in order to really get the full benefit of these books, you don't go into the next day's reading until you have finished the activities from the first days. And what you're doing with this is you're actually creating new habits, new patterns of behavior. So great books that I hope that you can pick up for yourself, or give the gift of leadership to someone else. So a couple more things that I want to show you here. The first is our poll question. So you will notice that everyone is muted on the call today. The reason for that is so that we don't have the distracting background noises. However, we do want this webinar to be engaging as possible, because that's where we're learning, is when we're engaged. So if you have questions or thoughts or something that you would want to share, please either type it in the question box, type it in the chat box, and we will respond as quickly as we can. If there's anything that we miss, we will definitely follow up with an email answering each of those questions. Also, you will see poll questions. When you see this slide pop up, that means we're going to do a poll. And we ask you just to jump in quickly and answer those poll questions, and then we'll share the results with you, and we can keep on moving. And that's another way of keeping things engaged, and for us to know a little bit more about who is with us in the audience. So at this point, I would like to introduce you to myself. My name is Michelle Braden. I am the President and CEO here at MSB Coach. And I also have with me today one of our newest team members, and his name is Anthony Young. And Anthony is our Marketing, Communications, and Admin lead. So he is today learning a little bit about how this process works, but he also is helping me with managing through any of the technical things and the questions that come in. So Anthony, we are so glad to have you here. Could you say hello to everyone?
Hey everybody, thank you for having me here, Michelle. I'm very excited.
Great. So as you join us for other webinars, you'll be hearing more from Anthony, and he's the one that sends out the emails to you. So feel free, you can respond to him as well with any questions that you have. So at this point, let's go ahead and begin to jump into our topic today, which is critical thinking, how the way you think can change the way that you lead. So an overview of what it is that we're going to cover today. We are going to talk about 3 different areas of power thinking or critical thinking. So you'll hear me use these words somewhat interchangeably as we move throughout today's webinar. These 3 areas are reasoning, insight, and self-knowledge. We'll break each of these down and we'll talk about how they show up internally and externally. We also will talk about the 10 human tendencies that reduce our leadership abilities. We'll do a quick review, and we'll talk about what are your next steps, and we'll encourage you to write down next steps for yourself. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So critical thinking, to truly engage in critical thinking, is a way of power thinking. Most of this information comes from 2 different sources. First is what's called the YAT assessment, which is the Yale Assessment of Thinking, and then also the book called Power Thinking. If you're not familiar with those books, and after today's webinar, if you are interested in taking a deeper dive, I highly recommend that you pick up these books. I will tell you, if you purchase the book, the assessment, a written assessment, is in the book, so you don't have to purchase the assessment separately unless you just wanted to. And if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've purchased the assessments individually. They're quite a bit more expensive than just the book, so you may just want to pick up the book if this is something that you're more interested in. All right, so let's go ahead and launch our first poll question. I'm going to send that out and ask you to respond quickly. So have any of you ever taken a class or classes on how to think? Okay, so we're at 89%. We'll wait just another second or 2 here to hopefully get to 100%. All right, so let's close the poll, and I will share those results with you. So looking at this, 38% of you said yes, you have taken a class or a workshop on how to think. 63% of you said no. I'm actually a little bit surprised at these results because most people have not ever taken any sort of a class on learning how to think because it's just not something that's taught. However, it would make sense with this topic that if you signed up for today's webinar that you would be interested in that, so maybe you have intentionally thought out classes on how to think. But when we think about critical thinking, if we don't have some sort of instruction, we are using the patterns that were actually developed when we were children. And so we wouldn't use the same patterns that were developed in other aspects, but yet we use those patterns in our critical thinking, and unfortunately, those don't typically produce the best results for us. A 1997 study showed that 74% of university graduates were never taught any sort of cognitive thinking strategies. So one of the most important aspects of any work that we choose to do is knowing how to critically think, and yet 74% of students were never taught any of these things. So it is important that as we learn these new skills, we begin to put them to practice, because practice is what creates those new neurological pathways, creates the new habits, and it is what makes permanent, not perfect. We're not ever going to be perfect as humans. Critical thinking does involve accepting new principles and taking simple actions repeatedly until they become an ingrained part of our thinking process. So that, again, is all part of those patterns of behavior and thinking. So just some interesting stats there to share with you. So when we think about leadership success attributes, what is it that makes a leader successful, and why is critical thinking so important? So we asked, not we, the research, and this all comes from the Power Thinking book that I shared with you. Leaders were asked to identify the elements of leadership they considered important to leadership success. And here are the things that they identified: vision, strategic thinking, relationship building, execution, people development, achievement and drive, adaptability, and self-awareness. So I'm going to launch a poll to see. Now, we weren't able to list all 8 of these individually. However, we collectively put them together in categories that would typically go together. What do you think your strongest areas are? So we're going to launch that poll and ask you to jump in. There we go. Okay, so if you can jump in and answer those poll questions, great, thank you. So again, this isn't about a right or wrong, it's just what do you think are your strongest areas? All right, we'll wait about 2 more seconds. Awesome, 100%, I love that. All right, so let's close this and let me share with you the results. So 22% of you feel that vision and strategic thinking is your #1 area. 44% of you believe that it's relationship building and people development. 11% of you feel that it's execution, achievement, and drive. And 22% of you feel that it's adaptability and self-awareness. So let's close that poll. And of course, the important thing for us to recognize is that all of these components are important. And we want to be careful not to overflex any one muscle. So how do we make sure that we continue to keep a hold of the areas that we're strong in while continuing to develop the other areas? So hopefully today's webinar is going to help to give you some insight and some ideas on how to do that. So leaders who go through this process of working on their cognitive skills or critical thinking skills, they show improvement in their decision-making abilities, problem solving, creative thinking, interpersonal skills, job satisfaction, job performance, retention, work attendance, positive attitude, their team's performance level. So I would ask you, if you're in a leadership position, one, if learning critical thinking skills is going to do this for you, this is extremely beneficial for you and those that work with you. But also, what if you extend that to the people who work for you and with you, to teaching them critical thinking skills, to have the benefit and the advantage of these characteristics in the people who work with you would be a great advantage. So when we think of critical thinkers, identifying the 3 areas are first reasoning. So when we look at reasoning, reasoning is the ability to identify the cause of a problem quickly. It also is the person, so people who have high levels of reasoning skills, people usually come to them for advice. So when you ask yourself, do I have high levels of reasoning skills? Well, do these 2 things align? And we're going to break these down even more as we go through. Second is insight. Insight is that exceptional ability just to instinctively know, here's a better course of action. Here's what it is that we're going to do. And I'm sure all of you have seen this quote, and that is, if it's taking you a long time to explain something, you probably don't know it very well. And so that would be the opposite of insight. So insight is where you just, you have that deep intuition of, here's the course of action we need to take. And oftentimes people who have high levels of insight are the catalyst for change. Then the third is self-knowledge. This is that component where you're quickly comfortable in any environment and you're able to have a real advantage, because people feel comfortable with you, you feel comfortable, and you're able to move forward. Without self-knowledge, it's hard to practice the reasoning and the insight. All right, so let's launch another poll here. What do you think of these 3 areas that I just identified? What do you think is your strongest area? Do you think it's going to be reasoning, insight, or self-awareness? So we'll take about 2 more seconds. Awesome. All right, so we'll close that poll and let me share those results with you. So 33% of you believe that your number one area is going to be reasoning, 11% believe that it's going to be insight, and 56% of you believe that it's going to be self-awareness. So great. We're going to launch this same poll again after I take a deeper dive and explain each of these. And so just take note if you still think that the area you identified is your strongest area, or if you may have a mind shift change as we go through this. So we will, as I mentioned, be taking a look at each of these 3 areas in a deeper dive. We're going to look at how they work internally and how, what's going on inside of us, but also how each of these areas show up externally. What are other people seeing and feeling when we have strengths in these areas? So when we think of reasoning, reasoning is the action of thinking about something in a logical and a sensible way. So we identified that reasoning is the mind's way of consciously taking thoughtful action and drawing conclusions. We also stated at the beginning that from the facts and evidence, you have the ability, when your reasoning is high, to know the cause of a problem rapidly. Like, here's what's going on without having to do a lot of research, bring consultants in, and believe me, there are times that we're going to have to do that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying when we are showing true reasoning and critical thinking in a certain area, this is what is happening. And then again, the one that people come to for advice and input. So when we think of internal reasoning, and my apologies, I'm noticing a typo there, internal reasoning and cognition, it is the mental strategies used to develop highly effective decisions and problem-solving solutions using creative thought. So just thinking there again about what that is, thinking about, so this is how it shows up internally. It's what's going on inside of you. External are the actions taken as a consequence of the thoughts that come from what's going on within your internal cognition. So let's break this down just a little bit more. So leaders who are strong in internal reasoning improve rather than demand proposals. So when they're talking with someone internally, they're thinking about, before that conversation happens, how do I improve on this, rather than demanding that something be changed the way I want it to be. Internally, they're going through what are the ideas that my team members have, my employees have, how am I valuing those? Am I giving them a fair hearing, or am I shutting things down if it goes against my own thought process or my own belief systems? They ask the question, and I love this acronym, this acrostic, WAIT. Why am I talking? So they really reason in their minds before they speak, that pausing before moving forward. Now, that pause may take just a second or two, or it may take a longer period of time, but being comfortable with that. We'll talk more about that in self-awareness. They practice in their own minds rephrasing others' comments and then using their own words. Now, this will also show up externally when it comes out of their mouth, but am I understanding this person correctly, by rephrasing that? They're reading body language, which means reading in between the lines, what's being said that's not being said here. Analyzing possibilities. What are the other possibilities? What could this person want? What do I want? Where do we want to go? What are we missing here? They practice internally in avoiding judgment and seeing things as only black and white. One thing's for sure, the more we know, the more we realize that we don't know. And so recognizing that internally with your internal reasoning. They're very careful to eliminate stereotypical thinking, or when they see their mind going there, they raise their awareness around that. that I'm putting someone or something into a category or a stereotype or basing something off of even my own bias and prejudices. They field test and revise segments of decisions before they are implemented. So there again, thinking through what needs to happen here, what adjustments do we need to make, what do we need to try out before we move forward and say, yes, this is what it is. They make appointments with themselves and consider that these appointments are just as important as any other appointment. You know, I do a lot of coaching, and this is one of the things that I see show up repeatedly over and over again, is that people are putting time on their calendars for things for themselves, whether that is just some think time, reflecting time, some time to, you know, even plan out their calendar, time to take a walk so that they can clear their head, time to exercise, whatever that is, and yet they will honor anyone else on the calendar that they have appointments with, but they don't honor their own appointments. So leaders who are strong in internal reasoning definitely make appointments with themselves, but then they also honor those appointments. So they identify the reasons that they do not complete the tasks or attain goals. So, you know, what's going on here that I'm not accomplishing this. They take action to avoid repeated mistakes that they have made because they failed to learn from them. So when somebody is continuing to make the same mistake, no matter what position that they're in, something's not being learned, and we're not practicing, you know, a higher level of reasoning and cognition. They replace excuses with explanations. So really taking a look internally to, okay, sometimes things happen, but what happened here, and how do we make sure that this doesn't happen again? Because we know, remember, we talked about practice makes permanent, not practice makes perfect. Things aren't ever going to be perfect. But how do we take a look at things and not make excuses for them, but determine what will we do differently moving forward? We use time strategically when problem solving. So there again, taking that time, and this goes back to putting time on your calendar, time to really process. If we are just charging ahead, and I know that so many workplaces, you know, change is just constantly happening, new information rapidly coming in, but if we're not taking the time to schedule time to think and to be strategic, then we're just gunslinging. And it's just a matter of time before it catches up with us or the mistakes that we're making begin to show up. Those who are high in reasoning write down possible courses of action as they think of them. So what happens a lot of times, and the reason this is so important, is that a lot of ideas pass through our head, and maybe somebody even says something in a meeting that triggers an idea. If we don't take the time to write that down, it could have been one of the most brilliant ideas, and we may never remember it. So keeping a notepad and pen by your side, or a phone where you have, you know, notes, a little note section, or a, you know, some sort of a pad where you can do that, whether it's electronic or real, so that you can jot these things down. And the important thing is not that you just jot them down, that you jot them down and you come back to use them again. So I'm pausing between each of these because I realize we are really giving you guys a lot of information here very quickly, and hopefully it's all being digested. They overcome the tendency to reach a quick decision. You know, I know in the workplace a lot of times leaders are rewarded for being able to move fast and make quick decisions, but recognizing that, you know, it's not just about clearing out the emails and responding as quickly as I can, but is this something I need to think about, even if it's just 5 or 10 minutes? Or is this something that it's better if I respond to it tomorrow after I've had a little bit more time? Because we so quickly want to triage and get things cleared off versus taking the time to think through them. Engaging in double thinking. So double thinking is just basically what we talked about here without reaching a quick decision, and that is thinking through, well, I've thought through this, have I also thought about this? And have I also thought about the other possibility with this? So really doubling back on processing through all of the different possibilities. So I'm going to leave that up here and pause for just a moment so you can glance through that. And feel free, if you have any questions, to go ahead and send those in before we move on to the next area. All right. So how does reasoning show up externally? Now, I'm sure just by us going through a lot of these things that happen internally, you can assume and presume how things would show up externally because both of them are so closely related. But leaders that are strong in external reasoning, they make their statements productive, meaning that they get to their point in their head before they speak. So I don't know if you yourself have ever done this or if you have ever been in a situation where someone is more of an external processor. So this isn't about a right or wrong, whether you're an internal processor or an external processor, but if you are more of an external processor and you are working on your external reasoning skills, it is important to discipline yourself to do that processing internally in your head. Otherwise, as you're talking, people are really confused because you could be going through multiple ideas in your head at one time. So I'm going to give you a simple example of choosing where to go to lunch. So an external processor, someone could say in a meeting, hey, where do you guys want to go grab lunch? And the external processor could say, well, you know, I've really been thinking about Chinese food because I've been craving Chinese food lately, although I am doing a low sodium diet and there's a lot of salt in Chinese food, so I probably don't want to go there. Mexican sounds good as well, but there's a lot of salt in that too. Why don't we go over to Subway? What do you guys think of that? Now, we could do that. However, what if you did that in your head? So when someone says, where do you want to go to lunch? And you just respond, I think Subway sounds good. What do you think? Now, that's a very simple and elementary answer, but hopefully you're getting the example of you really build confidence in others in your own reasoning ability when you are clear with the point in your head before you speak it verbally. Next, you want to use specific, concrete nouns, precise verbs, and avoid generalizations. So generalizations, obviously, don't want to state the obvious, but I do want to point out the importance of this, are things like you always, you never, and then whatever comes after that. But instead, the difference between, so if I'm talking to Anthony and I say, Anthony, yesterday when we were going through our emergenetics training at the 10:30 session, you made the statement of, versus yesterday, Anthony, in the meeting, well, maybe Anthony and I were in 3 different meetings together. And so there's not clarity of what it is that I'm referring to. So there again, being specific and avoiding those generalizations really helps to bring clarity in your own mind and the minds of others. Also, not prefacing your comments with disclaimers. So disclaimers are things like, well, it's probably not going to matter to you guys anyway. You've probably tried this before. Well, I've said this 100 times. Those are all disclaimers that actually end up discrediting what's about to come out of our mouth after that. Also, leaders with their external reasoning, they know when to assert, meaning that they know when to interject rather than constantly interjecting. Illustrate, meaning getting to their point quickly and then stop and back off. Because have you guys ever seen it when someone makes a really powerful statement and it's very meaningful and they recognize, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, that people are pleased with what was just stated, and then they state it and restate it about 4 or 5 different times because of the excitement and energy of the way that people are responding. So recognizing that when we are practicing external reasoning, we assert, we illustrate, and then we stop. Next, external reasoning shows up by granting yourself permission to do more than merely agree or disagree with a new idea. So how does that show up? Well, I love this technique. And by the way, the book Power Thinking is full, just chock full of all kinds of different techniques. I'm just sharing a few of them with you. But the look up and away. And what that does is when you're in a situation that maybe is intense, whether that's intense doesn't necessarily just have to be negative. It can even be, positive energy, but you need a breakaway. This looking up and away, literally moving your head away and letting your eyes go up and away can begin to separate in your brain where you can think of other possibilities and other ideas, and it breaks you free from that group think for that moment. I especially would encourage you to practice this if this is an area that you're working on, when you're finding yourself either overly agreeing with everything. Hey, wait a second, are we truly on the right path here? And maybe we are. Or overly disagreeing with things. If someone has presented something that really goes against your grain, practice is looking up and away and, how could that happen? Now, you may proceed next with asking questions, but practicing that look up and away before you do that. And then, of course, these will go in sequential order. The next would be collecting information and asking questions. So when you totally agree with something or completely disagree with new ideas, what sort of information do you need to collect to validate that, yes, it is correct, or either validate it's not correct, or maybe I wasn't correct. Maybe I wasn't looking at this in the right way. And even asking those questions when someone brings something up that you don't think will work. Or you think you know something different, instead of moving to, I'm using Anthony because he's sitting here as an example. Well, Anthony, how do you see that working? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Versus, no, we've tried that, that didn't work. How do we move to that open-mindedness of reasoning that shows up on the outside to others and invites them in? Next, we use matrices when facing complex situations to identify all the different factors that may be limiting your ability to plan. So how do we draw this out? However you do that, I know some people actually like to do it on their computer, some people do it on paper, whatever works for you, but just using that as a comparison and contrast to add things or to eliminate things. All right, so let's keep going. Moving now to the second component of powerful thinking, critical thinking, is insight. Insight is that capacity to gain an accurate and deep intuitive understanding of a person, a situation, or a thing. Now, I think there are a lot of people who have this ability in all three areas, and I've also seen that there are people who have stronger abilities, so maybe they're more intuitive and understand people. Maybe someone else is more intuitive and understands situations or things. To really grow our critical thinking, we want to flex the muscles metaphorically and develop each of these areas. So insight is the ability to know and to act without prior conscious given thought to that action, meaning that I'm not having to, sit back and think about it. Doesn't mean that's wrong. It just means when I am practicing insight, it is more intuitive in how it's happening. So we talked at the beginning, and I wanted to remind you of these two areas. So it is the exceptional ability to develop instinctively a new and better course of action. And typically, people who are high in insight, and when they are practicing it, they are the catalyst and the energy around change in an organization or a team. So taking a look at how does internal insight show up. So the breakaway and commit. This is where you are comfortable saying, let's take a time out, or I need a timeout. Before I commit to this, I need some time to process through it. I feel confident that I know where I want to go or where we're going with this, but I feel like and sometimes that break, by the way, can just be, all right, let's all take a 10-minute break. Run to the restroom, get some water, let's, take a few deep breaths and make sure that this is where we're moving forward. Next, exercise reverie, meaning that purposeful reflecting. And you can see how these dovetail into each other, I'm sure. So if we're going to be intentional to break away and commit, then hopefully during that time we're not just running and grabbing our phones and seeing how many emails we can triage off of there. Instead, it is that time of intentional and purposeful reflection of thinking about what it is that we said we wanted to reflect upon. It's using bracketing, and that means categorizing. Sometimes when we're talking about new ideas or concepts, we're just, now in brainstorming, yes, going all over the place is important, but not when we are beginning to nail things down. So recognizing how to categorize, whether that means that we have a flip chart and we put some things, in the parking lot, so to speak, or what techniques we use, but we are practicing categorizing, whether that is visually on the outside or internally in our minds. Next, those who are strong in internal insight, they are very comfortable with and they know their own approach. What sort of approach do I want and need to take here that is most successful? and they await their good indicators. So we know that there's, even in the book Blink, there's information about our gut responses. We also know about the gut responses. They are based off of learned behaviors. So when our gut is checking with us, that is, you don't really get a gut check if you don't have any sort of experience to back it up. So knowing what those good guttural indicators are of, yes, this is a good decision. We need to move forward, or, you know what, I'm still not feeling like this is the right place to move forward yet. And, I feel like I need to do some more purposeful reflecting. I feel like I need to break away here before I can commit. So you can see how these begin to flow together. Next, internal insight leaders know how to practice the difference between visioning and daydreaming. So the ability to, sit there. There's a book called Dream Manager, and I'm forgetting the author's name right now, but in the book Dream Manager, when I picked up the book several years ago because I thought it was about, being a great manager, and it's actually about helping to manage other people's dreams. But one of the things that he talks about in there is that he started scheduling time with himself, literally, to sit in his office for 15 minutes, feet propped up on his desk, head back, eyes closed, not daydreaming, but visioning. Where are we? Where do we need to go? And practicing that and the discipline of that, because it would be easy if you were doing something like that to start daydreaming, but being disciplined to practice that. Also adding something that motivates them when they become anxious. So I know this is something that I have really started practicing. There's certain days where the work that I have to do is more stressful than other days for me, just based off my own personality type. So what do I do at the end of that day that remotivates me? Or how do I take breaks in between? I was working on some pretty intense papers yesterday, and every time I would get 5 segments done, I would give myself a break to go outside and take a walk. And it's about a 10-minute walk, but it was enough that I was able to deep breathe, get outside, and then come in and dive back in versus trying to just plow through, which was more my previous techniques that I would do, just head down, let's get it done. But learning how to practice this is really beneficial. Also, the use of foresight when thinking about the future. And this would go back to practicing all of these things that are mentioned above in order to tie foresight in to what the future is going to look like, or what you feel like the future should look like. All right, so again, I'm going to pause there so that you're able to take just a moment and look at that, take any notes, and digest what you're seeing. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to write those in. All right, let's keep going. So how does external insight show up? So we've talked about all of these things that are going on internally inside of us. How do they show up to others externally? Well, first and foremost, people who are strong in external insight, they know how and when to say no effectively without it feeling like, oh, you always say no. Because if you always say no, then you're clearly not practicing this. But knowing when and how to say no effectively, where to draw those boundaries. They also value the truth in their own felt senses, and people are aware of that. So that goes back to that, what's going on inside of your gut, and then how do you articulate that? How does that show up on the outside? Next, they develop the habit of saying, tell me more to others when they're challenged. And so that challenge could happen in your own mind. Somebody may be sharing something in a meeting or a one-on-one session with you, and they don't even know that they have challenged you, whether they've challenged how you've done something in the past, they've challenged your beliefs, your values, whatever that may be that they may have challenged. Maybe they challenged your authority. How do you, in that moment, rather than going to defensiveness externally, how do you go to asking questions? And this goes back when we think of the internal insights, that formulating those questions in your mind before you ask them. Next, they engage the insights of subordinates, and by the way, this doesn't just have to be subordinates. It can be your peers, it can be your boss, whomever is working around you, engaging those insights when you're uncertain of the correct course of action. So if Anthony and I were working on something, and even though he's new, I wasn't quite sure. We're trying to. I'm just going to throw something out there. We're trying to double the people who attend our webinars. And so, I'm not sure. I've been doing this for 10 years now, and maybe I feel like I've tried everything. So to say to Anthony, what are your new insights? What do you think it is that we could do? And then if he starts sharing some things that maybe I think wouldn't work, or I think we've tried before, instead of going down that path, instead practicing that, tell me more. How would you see that happening? What would the benefits be? Next, they begin, but not at the beginning. And so thinking about this is that we don't always need or have to go back to square one. Now, there are some times that we do, but so many times we do that and clean the slate when we don't have to. So where are we now, and what do we need and want to do moving forward? Next, they increase commitment and creative thinking. So when you look at that bullet point at the bottom on the left-hand side of engaging the insights of others and asking powerful questions, that in and of itself increases commitment and creative thinking in others. And that's really what we want to do. And we want that to show up in our external insight. Next, they learn to establish effective and realistic deadlines. And I think both of those things are important. And then how do we create that accountability? They make assembly lines, which, this goes to that, what are those deadlines, who does what well, where do we position people according to that rather than just positioning them according to different titles. And how do we tie all these things in together that's showing up externally, that's maintaining the positive spirits, because people are committed, they're thinking creatively. The assembly line, and that's of course metaphoric, but is in such a way that things are flowing smoothly. People are doing what they do best, and so therefore the spirits are high, and we're creating this ultimate flow experience. When the flow experience isn't happening is when we need to go back to reasoning. And really think through what's not happening here. Tapping into reasoning, tapping into insight. So I'm going to pause again with this for you to take a moment and look at these, take any notes, and write in any questions that you have. All right, so let's move on. So before we go to the piece of self-knowledge, there's something that, a slide here that I really wanted to point out to you about the positive influences of creative thinking and then the negative barriers of creative thinking. Because when we think of insight, insight is all about us opening our minds to creative thinking, but it's also externally inviting others to open their minds to creative thinking. So the positive influencers are, how do we create a win-win solution here? Not anytime there is a win-lose, you are not being creative in the thinking process. How do we move from ultimatum thinking, or this is what it is, absolute thinking, that black and white that we talked about earlier, to what if thinking? What could this look like? What are the possibilities? Also, accepting, connecting, and joining ideas together. So, all right, Anthony, I'm hearing what you're saying. Here's what I'm thinking. How can we connect those two things together? How can we both get what we think is going to work by joining these together? So another way of looking at this, it could be some compromising that happens in there. And next, staying loose until rigor counts. So sometimes we dig our heels in too quickly, and we have to ask ourselves, is that really necessary to dig our heels in here? Because there are times, no doubt, to dig your heels in. But make sure when that is happening, it is at the right place rather than happening over everything. I remember years ago when I was first working on this, I put sticky notes all around that said to me, choose your battles. Because sometimes I was choosing battles that didn't need to be fought, or digging my heels in where they didn't need to be dug in. So, and there again, that may or may not be a challenge for you, but just being aware of it for yourself or for others that you work with. So now, what are the negative barriers on creative thinking? What are the things that, to be insightful, we want to avoid? Well, finding fault. So instead of moving to that, tell me more, we go to what's not working or why you're not working. Next, not having any sort of a plan of action for moving forward. Being impatient, not willing to wait through and search through to find the right answer in the process. And stereotyping, whether it's individuals, situations, products, processes, whatever that is, whenever we find ourselves stereotyping, we have moved away from creative thinking and we have created a barrier. All right, let's now move into the third area of our webinar focus today for critical thinking, and that is self-knowledge. So self-knowledge is this understanding of our own self, our own motives, and our own character. And does that align with who we truly are and how other people see us and what other people see us as? So thinking about self-knowledge, it is clearly defined and well-known attitudes and beliefs, meaning our own attitudes, our own beliefs, our own values, our own behaviors, our triggers. All of these things are very aware to us. They're not blind spots. Now, also self-knowledge would say, I'm also aware that I do have blind spots. And when things come up and I'm hearing things consistently in feedback and I'm the common denominator, what do I need to do to take a look at that? Those who are high in self-knowledge are quickly comfortable in any environment, giving them that advantage, also helping other people to feel comfortable and confident around them. So important in your self-awareness is to know your own individual attributes, your own beliefs, your own values. If you haven't gone through the process, and a lot of times in coaching engagements or in certain classes, they will take you through this process. If you haven't ever done that, I highly encourage you to go through this process, because a clear and accurate understanding of your own self is what constitutes your first step in becoming a critical thinking leader. So we must be self-aware. We must have these levels of self-knowledge if we truly are going to engage in proper reasoning and effective insight. So looking at this behavior paradigm, the importance of us knowing our values, our attitudes, and our beliefs, but then also knowing how do those affect my actions? Am I pleased with that connection between my values, my attitudes, and my beliefs and the actions that I'm taking? And I want you to think not only on a day-to-day consistent basis, but also when I'm under pressure, when I'm stressed, how are my actions reflecting positively or negatively on my values, my attitudes, and my beliefs? Next, how are they affecting my thinking? Is it possible when I'm under stress that I have, what we call that amygdala hijack? Where my emotional part of the brain completely takes over the frontal lobe and I'm not able to think logically and clearly, and therefore ultimately that would affect my actions. If that happens, I need to practice my self-knowledge in what behavioral changes do I want to make so that is not happening. Because when that is happening, it's going to be pretty challenging to go to any sort of reasoning and certainly any sort of insight. So how does self-knowledge show up internally? Well, here's some things that are going on. People who are aware internally of self-knowledge are likely to base their actions on what they believe. So going back to, that's why it's so important to know what you believe. It's important to know your values and also know what's important when something crosses those. What are you okay with? What are you not okay with? Next, they reinforce their reasoning and insight with a sense of stability and understanding that increases their self-knowledge. So because I have an understanding of myself and I'm comfortable seeking out an understanding of where you're coming from, I'm also aware that I don't always have to agree with that, but I do want to learn more because I'm open and I'm comfortable with that versus I'm threatened and I'm challenged by that. Next, They monitor their own self-respect. So am I drawing proper boundaries? Am I building walls rather than creating boundaries? What does this look like? How do I respect myself? And that's one of those pieces of where do I know when and how to say no? Do I say yes too much? Do I take on too much? Do I agree too much? Or just the opposite? Do I say no too much? Do I not agree? You know, where do I monitor this area? What is my own level of respecting myself? Because if I'm not respecting myself, you can almost be certain that other people are not respecting you. How do I repair proactively? So many of these are just so intertwined. So thinking about, as I talked about before, when you have days or weeks, and sometimes that happens, where you are spending metaphorically more energy chips than you're taking in. How do I manage my energy so that I'm refueling myself? You know, I like to use the metaphor of our cars. When our car light comes on that the gas is low, or the check engine light comes on, we would be remiss if we didn't take that car in to get more gas or to have the engine light checked. And so then if we find ourselves on the side of the road without gas, we probably have no one to blame but ourselves, unless for some reason our gas light wasn't working. However, we don't manage ourselves the same way. We need to be aware from a self-knowledge standpoint of what's going on internally inside of myself, what's draining me, and how do I refuel myself? What are those things that refuel me? Next, which as you can see, these go right in line together, make appointments with themselves. So if I need some time to take a 5-minute walk, if I need time to connect with family, if I need time to get more rest, if I need time to get more exercise, whatever that is, how do I make those appointments with myself and then honor them? And last, how do I turn my daydreams into visions? So recognizing there's a valuable place for daydreaming, but how do I move that into a vision that moves toward action rather than just having all sorts of thoughts? A while back, I worked with a very talented person who had a lot of ideas, a lot of, you know, quote unquote daydreams. However, this person really, really struggled to take those daydreams and turn them into a vision and action plan and possibility. So unfortunately, they weren't ever really truly able to reach their true potential because they weren't able to cross that span. So now moving to the final area, which is how does our self-knowledge show up externally to those around us? So recognizing first and foremost that what is going on internally does not always have to be displayed externally. Now, I know there's a lot about leadership and a lot that we have done around authenticity. And yes, I do believe as leaders that we should be authentic. But I also believe that we should be leaders and we should be demonstrating behaviors that reflect a leader and a leader that people would want to follow. And so I may be struggling with something at home, but that doesn't mean that I have to carry that on my sleeves and demonstrate that to everyone externally. So let's take a look at how self-knowledge shows up to others, especially when we're managing that. So there is increased enthusiasm with others around us. So think about it. When your behavior is consistent and people know that they can rely on that within you, you're going to increase their enthusiasm. You actualize confidence in the leadership role. So people are literally more confident in you. You identify the qualities of historical figures that you admire. So thinking about, and it doesn't, by the way, it doesn't even have to just be historical figures. Who are the leaders in your life? Could even be a parent. Could have been, you know, an athlete. It could be somebody that you've read about. It could be a former president. But who is someone that you really admire and why? And what are those characteristics? Now, we're not trying to create a mini them by any means, because you are you, but how do your behaviors align from a leadership standpoint? What is it that you admire in them, and where do you want to emulate some of those things, still being true and authentic to yourself? Next, achieving that self-actualization by realizing your full potential, recognizing what it is that you are capable of doing. We don't do a whole lot of work with younger people, but some of the work that I've done, and I've seen this in older people as well, but I've seen it more with some of the younger people that I've worked with. They have so much potential, but they don't have the self-knowledge and confidence internally to recognize it and to see it. Next, they identify others' good intentions. So there again, I love the statement, give people the benefit of the doubt. We can do this by asking questions, getting more clarity, always assuming the best in them. Building a strong support team around you. People, this shows up, their self-knowledge externally shows up with a strong support team. Exercising reciprocity, giving back to others who have given to you. Even when they haven't, how do you give to others? How do you persevere? There is a time to know when to give up, but then there's also a time to know when to push forward. And in fact, more times are pushing forward when you don't have much of the energy left. How do you dig down? How do you, remember we talked about self-heal, so to speak, so that you can persevere and move forward. What are your most valuable resources? And knowing those and the people around you, whether they're people or things. And how are you respecting those? Externally fulfilling the promises that you've made to people, keeping your word. And last, solving problems by probing for the best patterns of interaction between the people that are involved. So I want you to think for just a moment. We've got about 6 minutes left. So take just a moment and identify what are 3 areas of self-knowledge that you would like to improve your skills on based off the things that we've talked about. So if you want to take this webinar beyond just an hour here at your lunchtime or in the morning or in the evening, and you really want to do something with this, practicing this activity will help you to do that. So I'm going to pause here for just a moment, write down 3 things, and then next to that, even if you only write down 1 thing, you will see huge improvement. What action steps will you take? And how will you be accountable? So we're going to pause here for just a moment to give you some time to write those things down. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to write down at least 1 thing that you want to work on and 1 action step and how you'll be accountable to that. So let's launch our last poll of the day for this webinar anyway. Now that you have learned about all of these different areas, what do you think your strongest area is? Do you still think it's the same? Or do you feel like there are opportunities for growth and development in an area that maybe you didn't see? So how many of you think it's reasoning, insight, or self-awareness? Wow, our numbers have definitely changed. That's pretty cool, pretty insightful. All right, so we'll take about 2 more seconds here. Great, thank you everyone for voting. Let me share these with you. So now at this point we have, let me share this, 29% of you that believe reasoning is your strongest, 71% of you that believe self-awareness is your strongest. So I'm going to hide those and go back to the first one that we did, share that, so you can see the difference here. When we first took this poll, it was 33% thought reasoning, 11% thought insight, and 56% thought self-awareness. So just some interesting information for us to take a look at. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that. So a couple of things that I want to leave you with. The first is the 10 human tendencies that reduce our leadership effectiveness. Now I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. This is a lot of information here, and typically I wouldn't put this much information on the slides, but since we're doing this via webinar, I wanted you to be able to see it as well as hear it. So as I go through these, remember, these are things that reduce your leadership capabilities. And we are talking about people who are non-power or non-critical thinkers. So they tend to do what they do. They tend to do what they like to do before they do things that they do not like to do. Non-critical thinkers tend to do the things that they know how to do before the things that they do not know how to do. So they also do things where resources are more readily available before the things that they have to generate and locate resources. So just basically, they're doing what's easiest first. Non-critical thinkers tend to do the things that are easiest before they do the things that are most difficult. They tackle small jobs before they tackle the large ones and complete those tasks to get that instant gratification or immediate closure. Next, they tend to do things that require little time before they do the things that require a large amount of time, which often leads to focusing on the urgent at the exclusion of the things that are important. Next, non-critical thinkers tend to practice non-scheduled activities before they practice the scheduled ones, meaning like whatever is the distraction of the moment, because it's taking me away. We see this a lot with our phones, or the quote-unquote open door policy of just, rather than saying, no, can we come back and talk about this a little bit later, or I'm not going to get the instant gratification of looking at the pings that are happening on my phone in that instant, because what is scheduled for me to work on. Next, non-critical thinkers tend to respond to the demands of others before they respond to the demands of themselves, not prioritizing their schedules. Non-critical thinkers tend to readily respond to crisis and emergency or wait until a deadline approaches before they move to a strategic plan, which, by the way, that's just being reactive. It's not even a strategic plan at all. Non-critical thinkers tend to do the interesting things before the uninteresting things. There again, it's all about that instant gratification. Non-critical thinkers tend to respond in order of their personal agenda or personal things rather than to the things that are important and critical. Non-critical thinkers tend to work on things in the order that they arrive and address the things that make the most noise. Sometimes what's making the most noise is not what needs the most attention at that time. So I'm going to pause here so you can just take a look at these things. Really good, insightful information. So we're wrapping up today. We're right here at 1 o'clock. So remembering for you that practice makes permanent. The more you begin to practice these things, and the more, as soon as this webinar is over, if you begin to write some things down of what it is that you're going to do, you're going to be much more likely to move into that place. We become what we want to be by consistently being what we want to become each day. Remember, we are working to create these habits, and the only way we do that is to be intentional. I love this quote that I wanted to share with you. The problem is that most people spend their lives looking but not truly seeing. So hopefully this has pulled back the curtains a bit. We even saw that from that last poll that we ran to what we thought we were seeing in ourselves, and then once we just learned a little bit more information, what we felt like we had even more insight to. So in review, we identified the 3 areas of critical thinking: reasoning, insight, and self-knowledge. We broke these areas down and defined them, talking about how they show up both internally and externally. I had you do a writing activity of what are some steps that you could take. Well, first identifying, then what is the step, and how will you be held accountable. We looked at the 10 human tendencies that reduce our leadership ability, and I think if we're all honest with our self-knowledge, we see ourselves somewhere in there at different times. I certainly see myself in there on things that I'm constantly working on, because it is a journey for sure. This learning how to think better is a constant journey. We reviewed, and we want to end right now with next steps. So I want to pause here. I know we're at our time, but I want to encourage you to take just a moment and identify, not just identify in your mind, but identify by writing down what is your next step. Now, if everything's important, then nothing is important. So, I don't expect you to write down steps on everything that we covered because you probably wouldn't be successful if you did that. But what is one area of a next step for you? If you do have a mentor or a coach, I'd encourage you to incorporate them in this. If you don't, then I invite you to learn more about coaching, and we'd be happy to talk with you about that. I would also like to invite you to share your next steps with us, because that's a whole nother step of, even though we're not holding you accountable unless you wanted us to work with you as a coach, but it is just another step of sharing that information that you're going to be more likely to follow through with it. So as we close here, again, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate you taking this hour out of your day to grow and learn and continue to develop yourself. Remember our next upcoming webinars. Be sure to register for those, share them with others, and join us. Remember our 3 books on Amazon, which are all built around building powerful habits. And you have our contact information here. Feel free to reach out to us directly if there's any questions that we didn't cover today or something that you think about as time goes on, or if you're looking to hire a coach or to do some continued training of learning and development in the leadership and team building realm within your organization, feel free to reach out to us. And again, I want to say thank you so much for all of you being with us today, and hopefully we will see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you.